Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sticking around for this final talk of the day. I am the last one, right?
You are.
I am, okay. So the title of my presentation is The Research Applications of Web Archiving in the Social Sciences. And my hope is that you're going to leave here today and you might have an interest in exploring web archiving and its potential for your own research. So that you know what to expect over the next 20 minutes or so, here's what we will be covering. What web archiving is and how it works, how social scientists can leverage web archiving in their own work, and what Dartmouth's current infrastructure is for web archiving. And before we dive in, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about me and my corner of the college. So I'm Caitlin Birch. I work at the Dartmouth College Library. Specifically, I'm at the Rauner Special Collections Library, where the college's rare books and archives and manuscripts collections are. My official title is Digital Collections and Oral History Archivist, and that title is pretty representative of the split nature of my job. So I run the college's oral history program, which essentially encompasses teaching undergraduates the theory and practice of oral history, and then supervising their work as they go out and conduct oral history interviews of their own. My current project right now is in partnership with the history department, and it is called the Dartmouth Vietnam Project. The second part of my job is to be the college's digital archivist. So the library has always taken in material, valuable primary source material, but up until recently that material has been mostly paper-based. These days we're getting a lot more digital material, and that's coming in on everything from floppy disks to external hard drives. Just this week I got somebody's entire laptop computer in the mail. So, who's? Slam poet Jack McCarthy. Do you know him? No. You will soon. So as the digital archivist, I work with born digital material of enduring historical value, and my job is to make it accessible and usable for researchers. And importantly, for the purposes of this presentation, the digital portion of my job also includes a brand new web archiving program. And that segues right into my topic for today. I want to begin by defining, for anyone who might not be familiar, what exactly web archiving is. So web archiving is, quote, the process of gathering up data that has been recorded on the World Wide Web, storing it, ensuring the data is preserved in an archive, and making the collected data available for future research. So let's break that down a little bit. We have 4 distinct steps wrapped up in that definition, and they're all connected to this concept of data. So what is data in the context of web archiving? Well, data on the web appears in many different forms. You have traditional websites like dartmouth.edu. You have social media feeds like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. You have blogs built on platforms like WordPress, Blogger, and Tumblr. You have multimedia hosted through separate spaces like YouTube or perhaps embedded into another piece of data. And you have online forums like Reddit or the interactive components of Dartmouth's new massive open online courses, the MOOCs. In our definition of web archiving, all of these are examples of data. And so the first step in that definition is to gather the data. So a web archivist gathers data using a web crawler. You've all probably heard the term crawl in the context of search engines like Google. When you enter a search term into Google, you're initiating a rapid review of an index of websites. And that index is created and updated by Google's web crawler, Googlebot. Googlebot is programmed to visit a website and follow all hyperlinks on that site, recording data about what it finds and sending that data back to Google servers. It does this with trillions of websites, building out that index that you search each time you Google something. The process is much the same with web archiving, although much more targeted. A web archivist employs a crawler bot just like Google, and it gathers up relevant data into an index or an archive. So the next step after gathering is storage. Web archiving involves the deposit of data into a central location where it can be searched and accessed. In my Google example, the data went to Google servers. In the case of many web archives today, the data goes to a very large set of servers out in San Francisco, owned by the Internet Archive, which I'll get into more in just a little bit. So there's gathering, storage, and then the third step, which is preservation. The difference between a search engine like Google and a web archive is motivation. Google is collecting the data that's important in this exact moment, and Google's index is in a constant state of flux as a result. Websites appear, disappear, reappear from Google's index as the web itself changes. Nothing is indexed permanently. Web archiving developed as a sort of answer to this impermanence. So web archivists are concerned with indexing websites for the long term. Even after a website is removed from the internet, the archived version of it will persist. And this is really important when you think about the average lifespan of an individual web page, which most people put at about 44 days. The sites that host them may last longer, typically several years, but the unique content of each page disappears much more rapidly. So web archivists are enacting measures on the data they gather to ensure that it outlasts this decay. They're adding metadata to it, so that what they collect isn't just the website itself or the Twitter feed itself, but rich descriptions of those sites. And then they're combining the sites and the metadata descriptions into a file format called WARC, W-A-R-C, which stands for Web Archive File Format. And this is regulated by the International Organization for Standardization, which means that WARC files are stable and widely supported. And that brings me to the final step in the definition of web archiving, which is access. All the archive data in the world is pretty useless if no one can access it. So web archivists are focused on getting data out into the public. You can search a web archive the same way you can search for a book in the library. You visit an access portal, enter a search term, and review your results. In the library, the access portal is the library catalog. In web archiving, the access portal is a website communicating with the servers where the data is stored. Your search term will return results that give you direct access to relevant archived content and tell you about that content. Things like when it was captured, why it was captured, and who captured it. So now that we've covered what web archiving is, I want to talk a little bit about how it developed, because that really informs the work that's being done today and the work that Dartmouth is beginning to do. So the World Wide Web, as most of you probably know, was created in 1990 by computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee. And for the first few years of its existence, no one really seemed all that concerned with the ephemeral nature of information on the web. This was probably due in part to the size of the early web. By the end of 1993, there were still only 623 websites total. And compared to the billions that exist today, 623 was a pretty manageable number. The web started to grow really rapidly in 1994, though. In just 1 year, the website count jumped to 10,022. By the start of 1996, the web hit the 100,000 milestone. And it was at this point that the Internet Archive came on the scene. So the Internet Archive is a nonprofit founded in California in 1996 by Brewster Kahle. Its mission is to provide, quote, permanent access for researchers, historians, scholars, people with disabilities, and the general public to historical collections that exist in digital format, end quote. Since 1999, the Internet Archive has had a special focus on archiving websites. They began archiving the web in response to this growing concern that we're living through what historians will one day call the digital dark ages. It sounds sort of dramatic, but it actually is a serious situation. If you think about the types of materials scholars use today to make sense of the past, letters, journals, memos, scrapbooks, photo albums, things like that, and then you think about how we produce those types of materials today, you begin to see a problem. Very suddenly, the way that we document our lives and our work shifted from paper to computers. Archivists and records managers had a handle on paper, but no one was really prepared for this sudden digital revolution. Much of the early web disappeared before anyone thought to capture it, and once we did begin capturing it, the growth of the web outpaced us. So these were the dark years, when websites disappeared faster than we could preserve them. There's one really notable example, a Pulitzer Prize-winning piece of digital journalism from the Rocky Mountain News. This succumbed to digital rot that made it virtually unrecognizable. And this was a piece of journalism that couldn't be replicated in print. It had a lot of moving multimedia pieces, and it existed as a 34-part series on the web. And it's just gone. So the bad news is that the consequences of the dark years are going to follow us. We'll never be able to recover what we lost. But the good news is that we have the ability to save the new content that we're creating today, because web archiving is well established now. And the Internet Archive is still the leader in the web archiving field. To date, they've archived 469 billion web pages. In 2001, they developed the Wayback Machine, a search engine that anyone can use to search this giant collection of web history. I'm actually going to test out our internet connection here and see if I can demo the Wayback Machine. So if you've never used this before, basically you can enter any URL that you're familiar with into the Wayback Machine and see every instance that it was captured over the last 20 years. So I'm just going to do dartmouth.edu. And you can see that dartmouth.edu has been saved 3,870 times since 1996. And we can click into 1996, and there's the first capture on December 20th. And this is what the Dartmouth College website looked like 20 years ago.
All right.
So we've come a long way. Okay, get back into the presentation. Okay, so the Internet Archive has been doing this work since its founding, but one nonprofit acting alone can't really preserve the entire web. It's just changing too rapidly. So to address that challenge, the Internet Archive created a web archiving subscription service called Archivist in 2006. Archivist takes the technology of the Internet Archive, the technology that crawls and preserves websites, and it puts it in the hands of institutions like Dartmouth. The Internet Archive calls these institutions partners, which is an appropriate term since we're all working together to capture the web. As of today, there are more than 400 partner institutions in 48 US states and 16 countries, and it's growing pretty quickly. Each partner determines what websites are most important for them to archive, and they control how often those sites are crawled, how the archived versions are described, and how to make them available to the public. The Internet Archive provides the storage space for partner collections, but they don't have intellectual control over the content beyond that. So you might be wondering why, if the Internet Archive is crawling the whole web, it would be necessary for partners to help. It's important to note that most of the Internet Archive's crawling choices are made by computers. Advanced algorithms direct the crawler's movements. And while the algorithms get a lot of good content, they might not necessarily prioritize things the same way that a human would. To illustrate that point, there was actually a contributor to Forbes magazine last year who examined what sites had been archived the most over time, and the results were kind of unusual. Among the top 15 sites, historically, were 2 dedicated to porn, 1 for Turkish appliances, 1 for Lithuanian loans, and 1 for trampoline parts. The #1 most archived site was a Spanish movie pirating site. And I'm not sharing this information to undermine what the Internet Archive is doing, but to kind of emphasize the need for Archivist and the partner institutions that are using it. Partner institutions have humans rather than algorithms making decisions about what content to capture. And that's a significant point when we start to look at how web archiving can be used for research.
That's also an opportunity for creating selective histories.
For what? Sorry.
For creating selective histories. Right?
Yes.
Just, you know,
there is a
value
downside.
in having whatever quote unquote objective.
I definitely agree, and I think it's important that the Internet Archive isn't going to continue down that path while the partner institutions begin down another path, and we'll have both of them. Yep.
I have a question. I'm interested in looking at how the Facebook format has changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
So just looked at Facebook on the archive, and it just gives you the home page. Is there a way to see what it looks like after you log in 2005 or whenever it was invented?
Yes. In that case, you're going to need a specific Facebook account. So you could see your Facebook account if you had given the crawler access to it. For instance, I can log into Facebook and I can archive my web page that way. But a lot of this is behind password protection, so you're not going to be able to archive without permission someone's private content. Is that answering your question? Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the social sciences and how social scientists at some of these partner institutions are involved in web archiving. This is probably not the first time that you've heard someone talk about the web as a source of data for research. And I imagine some of you, if not all of you, have explored web-based data in your own research. What I found in my investigations of social sciences and the web right now is that the dominant methodology is not web archiving, but web scraping. And I want to make sure we differentiate between these two before going any further. So web scraping uses software to extract data sets from websites and download them to local storage. We come across online data sets every day, but we can only interpret them through a web browser. They're embedded in HTML and they're rendered as websites. If you think about the Dartmouth real estate as one example, if I'm new to the Upper Valley and I'm looking for a place to rent, I visit the Dartmouth real estate website and I see a list of properties that are available. Each property includes information like the price, the square footage, the number of rooms, and if I'm a prospective renter, it's useful for me to scroll through this and see it as a set of rental listings. If I'm a researcher and I'm studying the cost of living in rural America, I'm interested in the raw data about these properties, not the neatly packaged websites. So I might use a web scraper to scrape the data from the HTML and download it as an Excel spreadsheet on my computer. So from that example, you see the difference between web scraping and web archiving. Web scraping views the raw content of the website as the data. Web archiving views the entire website as the data. Both methodologies are valuable, and social scientists, I get the impression, are doing a lot of web scraping. What I'd like to focus on now is how social scientists can and are harnessing the power of web archiving. So I know that we probably have a number of disciplines represented in the room, and I may not cover each of them in the next few minutes, but my goal here is to share a few examples of the work that social scientists are doing at other institutions, with the disclaimer that if your discipline is not covered specifically in my examples, it easily could have been. There are definitely researchers in each discipline harnessing web archiving. Okay, so the first example I want to take a look at is the end-of-term web archive. Has anyone heard of this before? No. Okay. The end-of-term web archive was a collaboration between the California Digital Library, the Internet Archive, the Library of Congress, the University of North Texas Libraries, and the U.S. Government Printing Office. Researchers from these institutions joined together to capture the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in 2008-2009 as it played out live on the web. They regularly crawled more than 3,000 U.S. government agency sites between September 2008 and November 2009. And they ended up with a collection of 160 million unique captures. All of this archived content has been available to anyone with an internet connection ever since. So what were they trying to discover? Broadly, they stated the goal, quote, "The project team was to execute a comprehensive harvest of the federal government domains, .gov, .mil, .org, etc., in the final months of the Bush administration, and to document changes in the federal government websites as agencies transition to the Obama administration," end quote. And you can pretty easily see that they succeeded in this effort when you look at two captures of the official White House website immediately before and immediately after President Obama's inauguration. So here's the Bush version. This was captured January 20th, 2009. You'll note the emphasis on Bush's legacy right there on the sidebar under the Bush record, and that there's really a focus on the war on terror and national security here. Now here's the Obama version, captured only 2 days later. Aside from a dramatic design shift, you'll also note the emphasis literally on change, and that the highlighted issues are now the economy and the environment as opposed to national security. So that's just change over 2 days. So beyond the project team's broad goal to simply document the government in transition, you can imagine that there are research applications for a whole range of social scientists. And in fact, this project called upon historians, political scientists, government information specialists, economists, sociologists, and scholars from a number of other disciplines to determine what content to capture and why. So the second project I'd like to take a look at today is the Crisis, Tragedy, and Recovery Network. This is a collection out of Virginia Tech that began as a National Science Foundation grant in 2007. It's run by archivists, librarians, psychologists, political scientists, sociologists, and again, many other scholars from other disciplines. And the goal is, quote, "to collect, archive, organize, and provide ready access for scholars, professionals, and the public interested in supporting ongoing recovery of communities that have faced a crisis or tragedy," end quote. The motivation for the project came from the April 2007 mass shooting at Virginia Tech. but it's expanded significantly since then to document events like the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, the bombing of the Boston Marathon in 2013, and the more recent international Ebola crisis. I'm going to go ahead and try and visit the project website here. Okay, so this is the project website through Archivist, and you can see right here that we have 66 total results. What that means is that there are 66 collections within this project, and each one of them is documenting a different tragic event that has occurred since 2007. And if we take a look at one of them.
Sorry, how do you get active? You have to apply to see if your crisis or tragedy meets some threshold to get on there?
Well, so that's what the scholars involved in the project are determining, what's actually going to be captured. So it is a very curated collection. And I assume that some of the people involved in the project are interested in just objectively capturing anything that is of major national attention or international attention. But some people involved in the project have a specific research interest in perhaps earthquakes, mass shootings, something more targeted. So, okay, if we take a look at the earthquake in Chile, this is a collection that was put together in 2010 in the wake of that earthquake, and I just want to show you the kinds of things that are being grabbed here. So most of these appear to be news articles, things of that nature. If we go to a local one, okay, so this comes from Boston.com, and they captured it on March 15th, the day of the earthquake. Or no, sorry, several days after the earthquake. The earthquake occurred on February 27th. This is a capture of what the Boston.com page looked like on February 27th. And you can see it looks like an active website, but this website is in fact no longer active on Boston.com. You would not be able to find this now. But if you go to the Internet Archive, you can see the content just the way that you would have seen it in 2010.
Sorry, just said, so what's the real goal of this site?
Of this this particular project?
Yeah.
I really think that it's multifaceted. It's meant to be a data source, not only for the people involved in it, but for any researcher. So in that way, it's functioning the same way that Rauner functions on Dartmouth's campus. We're collecting material so that people with different research interests will be able to utilize it in different ways.
So say I do a Google search for like a crisis I'm interested in, like the one that we just talked about. What did I get? What would be different from doing that and going to this archive source?
So you have to look at it a little bit longer term in order for me to provide a strong answer to that question, probably. So some of this content that this archive is capturing is probably still available right now because we're only going back to 2007. So between 2007 and now, many of these websites may not have died. But place yourself 10, 20 years into the future, most of this content is going to be gone. So it's kind of like saying, you know, in the early 1900s, why did we need to save the first edition of Charles Dickens' work? It didn't seem that important then. It seems much more important now that we have it. So the age of this is kind of probably compromising the value right now. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with you as social scientists? I know some of you are at Dartmouth, and that's kind of who I'm focused on right now. Sorry to the rest of you who are from out of town. But I'm pleased to share that earlier this year, Dartmouth entered into a partnership with the Internet Archive. We subscribed to the Archivist service in January, and we're now all set to launch a web archiving program of our own. And the impetus for this program grew out of the library's mandate to collect materials that document the business and operation of the college, the kinds of materials that will be considered historically significant by the next generation. So Dartmouth's web archiving program was conceived as a way to combat data loss of those materials that are currently shifting from print to online. I'm talking about things like the course catalogs or commencement information. So boring official college business that somebody will want to look up later on. But that's not our only priority with this web archiving program. Like all other library initiatives, it's grounded in the library's mission. That mission is to, quote, foster intellectual growth and advance the mission of Dartmouth College and affiliated communities by supporting excellence and innovation in education and research, managing and delivering information, and partnering to develop and disseminate new scholarship. So if we're looking at that mission, the goal of the web archiving program is not just to document the college's official business as it's conducted on the web, but to collaborate with the scholars in the Dartmouth community as they go about their teaching and learning. So if I've piqued your interest at all today, the web archiving program is here as a resource for you. I don't know what each of you individually is researching right now or what projects you might be conducting with your students in the classroom, but I do know that the sample collections that I shared with you earlier, that type of work can be done here at Dartmouth now. Maybe you're a psychologist researching grief and you'd like to begin archiving memorialized Facebook accounts. That's the kind of thing that we can do. If you're a political scientist and you're interested in the changes in campaign websites over time, we can do that now. Whatever your focus, I hope that you'll walk away from this talk and think about the way that web archiving might provide data for your own research. And if you come to the conclusion that it's a method that you'd like to explore, please don't hesitate to get in touch. My contact information is here on the screen, and I would love to talk about the ways that the library and you and your department can collaborate. So thank you. Oh, okay.
So there's a very strong accent on the web here, and I was wondering on what, if any, efforts are going on to sort of do archiving as like an important sort of, like I very much buy into the argument you made about the importance of documenting sorts of things, but like as things shift like apps in your phone, right? Like we're no longer sort of like putting things on web pages that can be sort of publicly accessed. So what are ways in which sorts of librarians and archivists are thinking about how do we sort of document and record the evolution of like apps and like interactivity and content that's being produced on apps where it's not accessible on the web?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer because that's kind of the next frontier for us. We're, as archivists, that's the we I'm talking about here, are kind of excited that we're now archiving the web and email. Email was a huge one. The whole mobile shift is, we're always behind, right? So that's the next one that we're going to have to tackle. It's an excellent question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like Yik-Yak and what was going on after student protests, not just in Dartmouth, all over the country, and that would be really nice to have.
Yeah, that's one of my main goals. So when I talk about the official Dartmouth web presence and how that's our first priority with this program, I'm going beyond just like dartmouth.edu, and we're looking at social media that has to do with Dartmouth. Some of you are probably aware that there was a social media movement out of the NAACP student chapter this week. It was #DoBetterDartmouth, and they did a social media blitz on Tuesday and Wednesday. So I'm going to try and capture that hashtag, that specific hashtag. So a lot of this happened with Black Lives Matter, this focus on, not at Dartmouth, but nationally. The Black Lives Matter hashtag was a big focus of web archiving when that was all going on, and it still is, because that hashtag has turned into a whole movement.
Is there a plan with the Internet Archive for maintaining the usability of this data in a long-term time frame in the future? Just like in terms of the data is physically preserved, like on the hard drives, and like 100 years from now, is this data still going to be like available in some format?
Yeah, my answer is I hope so. That's the goal of any digital archivist, is to constantly be migrating data forward. You probably know that if you have something sitting on an external hard drive right now, it will have rotted 5 years from now. So,
Good to know.
so I also, along with that computer I got in the mail this week, I got a box of 88 floppy disks, and I haven't tried to access any of them yet, but the longer data sits on external digital media, the more susceptible it is to rot. So
this is probably outside of the realm necessarily of what you're talking about, is about our expertise. But do you know if there's any work going on physical data storage devices that are capable of preserving digital data
for the long term? I'm sure there is. I mean, it would be in the best interest of people who are producing external hard drives to produce better external hard drives, but I don't really know that that's going to be a solution. It's sort of like paper rots no matter what we do, and we can treat it so that it lasts longer, but one day it will fall into little bits, and nothing is forever, but the goal, yes, but the goal is to make it as close to forever as possible.
So what I'm having a hard time understanding is how websites disappear from the internet. Is this like the nature of the internet changes and then the website is somehow lost into oblivion, or is it that the website chooses to take down that article or that story, or is it both, or something else?
Yeah, it's both. The article series in the Rocky Mountain News that I alluded to, they didn't take that down, they just ignored it. They published that story, I think, in 2006, and they put it up on the web. They had this whole team of digital engineers basically working on this, and then they left it, and they didn't do any maintenance. Over time, the files started to rot, and when they went back to look, they were deteriorated past the point of being able to recognize the original product. But then you have other cases, like with Boston.com, they circulate material in and out. It's not all going to be there forever, because even with digital, there's space issues to think about. Storage is not infinite, so they'll take down their older content to make room for their newer content.
I'm just curious, at the tool level, like things that you use to sort of image a floppy or whatever, how much crossover is there with the world of forensics and sort of CSI criminal chasing work?
Yeah, there's huge crossover. So digital forensics figured this out first. The cops figured this out first. They started using a forensics recovery of evidence device called FRED, and they were doing this to solve crimes. And then the archival community kind of hopped on board with that, and we now use the same technology that they're using to preserve digital content that comes into us as historical material. So I don't have the official FRED in my office, but I have one that we made from scratch. And yeah, that's where my floppy disks are going to go.
So say you have a research question that could be answered by looking at lots and lots of campaign websites. Where would you go if you were at any institution to look to see if there was already a curated project somewhere on that, or how would you go about doing that yourself?
Yeah, so if you go to archive-it.org, that's the website of Archivist, obviously, and you can just do a basic keyword search there, the way you would do a keyword search in the Dartmouth College Library. If you know of an existing collection, you can narrow down your search by the institution that created it. You can also search the Internet Archive in general. So Archivist is specifically for the partner institution collections, whereas the Internet Archive is what's being crawled daily by Heritrix, the Internet Archives crawler.
To build on that, so I have a colleague at Rutgers who's doing, like, backing up a step, and this maybe speaks to Michael's point, is that my understanding is that the Wayback Machine only surfaces a fraction of what the Internet Archive actually has, because they're doing this much more regularly, and I don't know what sort of heuristic they're using about why they surface some things but not others, but you can go to the Internet Archive and they actually have much more available to researchers than they kind of display on the Wayback Machine. So my colleague Matthew Weber at Rutgers does all his political communication stuff, so he's interested in like how do the congressional press releases, they go up, they come back down for political strategic reasons, but the Internet Archive is grabbing those, but those wouldn't come up in the Wayback Machine, but they still kind of exist in the Internet Archive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's kind of two sides of the applications that I see for people who are doing social sciences research. You can take other people's data and you can do something like that with it, or you can curate your own data. It's really a matter of what fits your project. And I guess what I was focusing on a little bit more here is if you have a research interest and you think that this could be data for you, create that data yourself, collaborating with us on this service. But you can take other people's data the same way that you would in traditional research and apply it to your own research questions.
no other questions, then thank you, Caitlin. And